This year, as it happens, the celebration of the holiday commemorating the birth of Reverend Martin Luther King, which will be observed tomorrow, January 20th, comes in the aftermath of the death and remembrances of former South African president and freedom fighter Nelson Mandela. As might be expected, there have been the inevitable comparisons of the work of Dr. King and Mr. Mandela in their efforts to seek freedom and justice for Africans and African Americans during the 20th century. What I'd like to explore this morning is the Unitarian Universalist connection between these two giants in the fight for justice and human rights. And of additional interest is how the Hindu faith, as well as the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, plays a part in this story. As we shall see in good Unitarian Universalist seventh principle fashion, these stories fashion more of a web than a single thread. Our story begins in the early 1800s in the vicinity of Boston, Massachusetts. Well, not really. Arguably, the story goes all the way back to ancient India during the Vedic period, when the teachings that form the basis of the Hindu faith, the Vedas, especially the Bhagavad Gita, were gathered and written down and finally translated, so they became more universally accessible. Now, not being an expert on Hinduism, I'll leave the details of this to others more knowledgeable than myself, but I'd like to look at how they play a part in our story. In the 1820s and the 1830s, there emerged a literary and philosophical movement in New England that included Ralph Waldo Emerson, a Unitarian minister, writer, and philosopher, along with his disciple and friend Henry David Thoreau. Known as Transcendentalism, some in this movement were troubled by what they saw as the sterile intellectualism of Unitarianism, what Emerson famously called corpse-cold Unitarianism. Emerson, Thoreau, and their compatriots were drawn to other sources of spiritual experience, including reverence for the natural world, as we heard in the story this morning, and Eastern religious traditions, especially Hinduism. Writing in Walden an account of his year living in a small cabin on Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, Thoreau observed, "In the morning, I bathed my intellect in the stupendous and cosmogonical philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, since whose composition years of the gods have elapsed, and in comparison with which our modern world and its literature seem puny and trivial. And I doubt if that philosophy is not to be referred to as a previous state of existence, so remote in its sublimity from our conceptions. I lay down the book and go to my well for water, and lo, there I meet a servant of the Brahman, priest of Brahma, and Vishnu, and Indra, who still sits in his temple on the Ganges reading the Vedas, or dwells at the root of a tree with his crust and water jug. I meet his servant come to draw water for his master, and our buckets, as it were, grate together in the same well. The pure Walden water is mingled with the sacred water of the Ganges." Now, in 1849, about 2 years after his time at Walden Pond, Thoreau published his famous essay on the duty of civil disobedience. This essay was written in the context of Thoreau's long-standing views regarding the abolition of slavery and his opposition to the Mexican War, which he saw as an unjustified act of American imperialism. As he saw it, the American government, both at the national level and the state level through the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, were implicated in these acts. And it was the duty of citizens of conscience to oppose these governments by disobeying the law if necessary. Now, Thoreau didn't have a lot of time for government generally. At the beginning of civil disobedience, he states, "I heartily accept the motto that the government is best which governs the least," a point of view more in keeping with modern-day libertarianism than modern-day liberalism. Beyond that, Thoreau argues that under some circumstances, the individual is not obligated to follow the law, even if it's determined by a majority vote. He writes, "Must the citizen ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislation passed by the majority? Why has every man a conscience then? I think we should be men first and subjects afterwards. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect so much for the right as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think is right. Now, putting this argument into practice, Thoreau refused to pay a local poll tax. And for his refusal, he was jailed overnight in the town jail. But the next day, a friend, without his knowledge or permission, paid the tax for him, and he was released from custody. While Thoreau's small act of resistance had little demonstrable impact on either the issue of slavery, which was ultimately decided by the Civil War, or the Mexican War, approximately a century later, it was to have a central impact on the struggle for racial and social justice in the United States and elsewhere. In the 1890s, a young British-educated Indian lawyer, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, went to Durban, South Africa to practice law. While living in South Africa, he experienced firsthand the discrimination against people of color, both Africans and Indians. Gandhi emerged as a leader of the Indian community as it protested discrimination against the Indians, including the requirement that all of them carry passes and be subject to segregation regarding where they could live and work. At one point early in his time in India, Gandhi was thrown out of a train for refusing to travel in a third-class car when he had purchased a first-class ticket. As an advocate for his fellow Indians, he first developed and applied what came to be known as satyagraha, a form of nonviolent resistance, which later he would apply in the struggle in India. In his justice work, Gandhi was guided by two principles. The first, satya, means that truth, which can be found in all religious traditions in some form, had to be applied to all our actions. We have to act with truth. While Gandhi himself was a Hindu, he also found guidance in Christianity, especially the Sermon on the Mount, as well as the teachings of Islam and Judaism. In fact, he had a picture of Jesus that he carried with him. When asked if he was a Hindu, Gandhi is reported to have replied, "Yes, I am. I am also a Christian, a Muslim, a Buddhist, and a Jew." The second principle that guided Gandhi was that of ahimsa, or nonviolence, which meant that all living things should be protected from violence and killing. Raised in the Jain tradition, he was a strict vegetarian. But Gandhi was also deeply influenced by Thoreau. He read Civil Disobedience in 1907 and was greatly affected by it. He wrote, "Thoreau was a great writer, philosopher, poet, and withal a most practical man. That is, he taught nothing he was not prepared to practice himself. He was one of the greatest and most moral men America has produced. At the time of the abolition of slavery movement, he wrote his famous essay on the duty of civil disobedience. He went to jail for the sake of his principles in suffering humanity. His essay has, therefore, been sanctified by suffering. Moreover, it was written for all time. Its incisive language is unanswerable." The principles of satya and ahimsa, along with the ideas of Thoreau, became the basis for Gandhi's battle against discrimination in South Africa, as well as his longer and more well-known struggle for independence in India, which led from approximately 1915 until his death from an assassin's bullet in 1948, after Indian independence had been achieved. Professor Nick Geer, professor emeritus at the University of Idaho, suggests that Gandhi, and later Dr. Martin Luther King, applied three principles to the concept of civil disobedience as a strategy for promoting social justice. 1. Maintain respect for the rule of law, even while you are disobeying the specific law you perceive as unjust. Thoreau was willing to pay taxes for the upkeep of roads, for example, because he believed that was a just impost on the people. On the other hand, he was not willing to pay taxes that would maintain the institution of slavery or promote the Mexican War. The second principle, plead guilty to any violation of the law. Gandhi said he would cheerfully submit to the penalty for violating what he believed to be unjust laws. King and Thoreau did so as well, and all of them spent some time incarcerated for their actions, albeit for Thoreau, it was only overnight in the town jail. A person engaged in true nonviolent civil disobedience does not fly around the world seeking sanctuary and asylum from prosecution for his acts. 3, attempt to convert your opponent by demonstrating the justice of your cause. The goal of nonviolent direct action or civil disobedience is not to defeat or humiliate your opponent. Rather, for Gandhi, the purpose is to win their friendship and understanding. Or in the words of Dr. King, the aftermath of nonviolence is the creation of the beloved community. Returning to India in 1915, Gandhi began a 30-year struggle to achieve independence for India, which at that time was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And to do this, Gandhi employed his strategy of satyagraha to ultimately force the British to grant independence to India in 1947. Now, Thoreau, through Gandhi, influenced another young South African leader born about 50 years after Gandhi, who became one of the most honored freedom fighters of his time. Nelson Mandela was born in 1918, shortly after Gandhi returned to India. And he joined the African National Congress, one of the leading groups promoting equal rights, in 1944. This was the beginning of his political activism against apartheid. At a function celebrating Mandela's 94th birthday, Harris Majiki, an ambassador of South Africa to India, stated that while Mandela is the father of South Africa, Mahatma Gandhi is our grandfather. Majiki went on to say, Mandela was inspired by the Satyagraha campaign led by Gandhi. It was a compelling act of passive protest against oppression. This would later inspire the formation of the African National Congress and strengthen Mandela's belief in our shared humanity. Mandela acknowledged his debt to Gandhi, calling South Africa Gandhi's country of adoption. However, Mandela was also mindful of the difference in their outlooks and the movements that they led. While for Gandhi, nonviolence was a moral imperative, for Mandela, nonviolence was not a moral principle, but a strategy. Mandela attributed this in part to the nature of their adversaries. For Gandhi, the opponent was the British in India, who, while a colonial power, adhered to the same basic rules as Gandhi, at least as Mandela saw it. The Afrikaners, the descendants of the early Dutch settlers, according to Mandela, met peaceful protest with violence. When this happened, the ANC, African National Congress, responded in kind. Unlike Gandhi, for Mandela, violence and nonviolence are not mutually exclusive. It is the predominance of one or other that labels the struggle. Mandela even quoted Gandhi himself as approving violence where the choice was set between cowardice and violence. Although I'm not aware of a situation where Gandhi himself advocated violence, but it may be there. The campaign of Mandela and the African National Congress was ultimately successful, culminating in Mandela's release from prison after 27 years, and his election as President of the Republic of South Africa in its first free and open election in 1994. Meanwhile, Thoreau's roots of civil disobedience returned to the United States during the civil rights struggle of the 1950s and 60s. In 1955, a young Baptist preacher, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., stepped into the leadership of a campaign to boycott the buses of Montgomery, Alabama, in order to protest segregation and mistreatment of black passengers. Last night, one of my granddaughters in her Sunday school class got to play the part of Rosa Parks No. 2. She was very proud of that. As an undergraduate at Morehouse College, King first read Thoreau, and later at Crozer Theological Seminary, he was introduced to the work of Gandhi, applying Thoreau's principles to the fight for justice. In Montgomery, King sought to apply Thoreau and Gandhi's ideas to the practical problem of achieving desegregation in the southern United States. In reflecting later on his successful campaign, King made a number of observations in an essay called The Power of Nonviolence. Nonviolent resistance is active resistance, not passive acceptance of injustice. According to King, the method is non-aggressive physically, but strongly aggressive spiritually. The goal of nonviolent resistance is not to humiliate the foe, but to win his or her friendship. While the aftermath of violence is bitterness, King says, the aftermath of nonviolence is creation of the beloved community. The goal of the nonviolent resistor is to attack the evil systems rather than the individuals who are caught up in that system. When there is a victory against injustice, it's not just a victory for the oppressed, but rather the entire community will benefit. Nonviolence is not just an external matter. It not only avoids the external violence, but also the internal violence to the spirit of the protester. The central principle of nonviolence is love. Not romantic love or love for those you like, but rather the agape love described in the New Testament and by Dr. King as understanding, creative, redemptive goodwill for all people. And finally, King believed that there is some force in the universe, which some may call God, that strives for justice. Dr. King was fond of a phrase he borrowed from the Unitarian minister, Reverend Theodore Parker. As King put it, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Just as Gandhi found a spiritual dimension for his work, so did Dr. King and many of his followers. 6 years after Montgomery, writing from the Birmingham jail where he was incarcerated for leading a march in violation of a court order, King reflected on how he could justify breaking some laws and obeying others. King observed, the answer lies in the facts there are two types of laws, just and unjust. I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Referring to St. Thomas Aquinas, Dr. King distinguished just and unjust laws as follows. An unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. By the time of his death, Dr. King's strong advocacy for nonviolence was being challenged from some younger black activists, notably Stokely Carmichael, the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, some of the leaders of the Black Panther Party, and some factions of the Black Muslim movement. Yet King remained committed to nonviolence as evidenced by his presence in Memphis in April of 1968, supporting the striking sanitation workers. On April 6th of 1968, just 2 days after his assassination, Look magazine published an article that Dr. King had written in which he reflected on a nonviolent campaign he had planned for the following summer. In this article, he expressed the fear about what would happen if nonviolent action did not get a more positive response from the federal government. King wrote, "As committed as I am to nonviolence, I have to face this fact. If we do not get a positive response in Washington, many more Negroes will begin to think and act in violent terms. I hope instead that what comes out of these nonviolent demonstrations will be an economic Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, requiring about $10 to $12 billion. Tragically, Dr. King, the apostle of nonviolence, like Gandhi before him, fell to an assassin's bullet before this march, what came to be known as the Poor People's March, led by his friend and fellow collaborator, Dr. Ralph Abernathy. Given the Vietnam War and a changing political climate, the Economic Bill of Rights was not to be. So where are we today as far as nonviolent direct action is concerned? We've seen examples of it in recent years. The massive marchers at the state capitol in Wisconsin, the Occupy movement, demonstrations and civil disobedience against the mistreatment of immigrants in Phoenix by Sheriff Joe Arpaio. These are certainly in the long tradition of Gandhi and King. Yet many of the issues that we face today are harder to get a handle on. Segregated lunch counters and denial of voting rights are easy targets to identify, and the remedies are fairly clear-cut. Income inequality and the failure to pay a living wage, while equally serious problems are harder to find a remedy for and dramatize with a demonstration. Of all the recent justice campaigns, I think the Occupy movement seems to have had the most success in getting attention for its cause. Yet as religious liberals, we must be comforted by the fact that the arc of the moral universe is long, and it bends towards justice. When Gandhi decided to stand up against the might of the British Empire, not many would have given him very good odds in ousting the British from India. When Dr. King confronted the entrenched governments of the South and the determined opposition of Southern Democrats to guaranteeing voting rights for African Americans, no one would have predicted the success of his movements. On many issues today, one can be disheartened by the prospects for success. Yet we have seen time and time again that the moral arc of the universe is long, and it does bend towards justice. Or to put it another way, we shall overcome. So let's see what you folks have to say.